She walked into the courtroom like she owned the place. Blonde hair, perfect, designer jeans, flawless. But the words on her shirt made the room freeze. F black people. The judge's gavel slammed down, but Jessica just smirked. That smirk didn't last long. What happened next left everyone speechless. It was supposed to be an ordinary day in the courtroom. Judge Rebecca Hayes had presided over hundreds of cases over her long career. After nearly 2 decades on the bench, there wasn't much that could surprise her anymore. Or so she thought. That morning, she had arrived at the courthouse prepared for a routine set of cases. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and maybe a small civil case or two. The usual. Predictable. The room was already buzzing with quiet chatter as the next case was called. Rebecca sat tall in her seat, the high wooden bench giving her a commanding view of the courtroom. Her dark brown hair, just starting to show streaks of silver, was pulled back into a low bun. Her black robe sat comfortably on her shoulders, the weight of it familiar after so many years. The gavel rested beneath her fingertips, and her sharp hazel eyes swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces, the bailiff, the court stenographer, the regular attorneys. And then the doors opened. She entered the courtroom with the kind of confidence that immediately drew attention. Jessica Cole, mid-30s, blonde, and undeniably beautiful, strutted toward the defendant's table as if the courtroom was a runway. Her designer jeans clung perfectly to her legs, her white tank top loose and effortless. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, a deliberate sound that seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the hushed room. But it wasn't her beauty or her expensive outfit that made the room freeze. It was the words printed boldly across the front of her shirt in large black letters. F black people. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp and immediate. A few people in the gallery whispered to each other in disbelief. Someone let out a soft, horrified laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when the mind can't quite process what it's seeing. Rebecca's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her fingers curled around the handle of her gavel as her pulse quickened. She could feel the tension in the air sharpening, becoming something tangible. The African-American bailiff, David Carter, stood frozen near the judge's bench. His jaw was tight, and Rebecca could see the muscles working beneath his dark skin as he struggled to keep his composure. Jessica Cole sauntered toward the defendant's table and slid into the chair like she had all the time in the world. A slow, lazy smirk curved her lips as she crossed her legs and leaned back in her seat. The white tank top sagged slightly at the neckline, making sure the offensive words on her shirt were clearly visible to everyone. Rebecca's gaze shifted toward Jessica's lawyer, a pale, nervous-looking man in a cheap suit. His thinning hair clung to his forehead in sweaty strands. He sat stiffly next to his client, flipping through a disorganized stack of papers with trembling hands. He clearly didn't know what to do, or how to handle the disaster that had just walked into the room. Rebecca's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Silence in the courtroom. The whispers died immediately, but the tension remained. The words on Jessica's shirt hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and suffocating. Rebecca let her gaze settle on Jessica, studying her carefully. "Miss Cole," Rebecca said, her voice sharp and controlled, "would you care to explain your attire?" Jessica's smirk widened. "What's there to explain?" Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You are aware that you're in a court of law?" Jessica shrugged. "Last time I checked, it's still America. Free speech and all that." Rebecca's jaw tightened. Her hazel eyes sharpened. "That is not free speech. That is hate speech." Jessica leaned back further in her seat, arms stretched lazily across the back of the chair. "Tomato. Tomato." A muscle in Rebecca's jaw twitched. Her fingers tightened around the gavel, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Years of experience had taught her not to give people like Jessica the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. David shifted slightly at his post, standing just to Rebecca's right. His eyes never left Jessica. His hands were still tightly clenched at his sides. Rebecca could almost feel the heat radiating off him, barely contained fury, held back only by sheer discipline. An older black woman sitting in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth. Her eyes glistened with tears. A young man beside her, possibly her son, put a hand on her shoulder and gave her a tense nod. Across the room, a group of attorneys whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. Jessica's smirk widened as she casually adjusted the hem of her shirt, making sure the offensive words were fully visible. Her gaze slid toward David, and Rebecca didn't miss the flash of malice in her eyes. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Jessica knew exactly what she was doing. "Ms. Cole," Rebecca said, her voice cold as steel, "you are here for a traffic violation, but it seems you've chosen to make a statement." Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "You believe this is funny?" Jessica's smile widened. "I think you're overreacting." Rebecca's gaze darkened. "Interesting." Jessica's lawyer finally found his voice. He cleared his throat and stood awkwardly. "Your Honor, Rebecca's gaze cut toward him, sharp and unforgiving. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway." The lawyer hesitated, but then sank back into his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment. Jessica chuckled softly. "You're really making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be." Rebecca's hands curled into fists beneath her robe. "Let me be perfectly clear, Ms. Cole," Rebecca said, her voice low and dangerous. "This is a court of law. You are free to express your opinions elsewhere. But in my courtroom, hate speech and disrespect are not tolerated." Jessica's smile turned razor sharp. "Sounds like discrimination to me." David's jaw tightened further. Rebecca felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She was walking a tightrope here, balancing the need to maintain order with the burning desire to put Jessica in her place. Jessica's gaze slid toward David again. "What's wrong, officer?" she purred. "Feeling uncomfortable?" Rebecca's chest tightened. Jessica was baiting him, baiting all of them. David's voice was tight when he leaned toward Rebecca. "Do you want me to remove her from the courtroom?" Rebecca inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain calm. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to order Jessica out, to make an example of her right then and there. "No," Rebecca said, her tone flat and controlled. "Let her stay." Jessica's smile widened, but Rebecca caught the flicker of hesitation behind her eyes. Rebecca leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Jessica like a predator stalking prey. "Let her stay," Rebecca repeated. "I want to see how this plays out." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, her confidence slipping. Just a fraction. Rebecca's lips curled into a small, cold smile. Jessica had no idea what was coming. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every breath, every shift of movement seemed to crackle with restrained energy, sharp and dangerous, like a storm building just beneath the surface. Jessica Cole sat at the defendant's table with the kind of smug confidence that made Rebecca's skin crawl. Jessica's shirt. "Fev, black people." Sat like an open wound in the middle of the courtroom. Its message was impossible to ignore. It poisoned the air, filling the space between Jessica and everyone else in the room. The message screamed louder than any spoken words, louder than any argument. Jessica seemed to know exactly what kind of chaos she was stirring up. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, loose strands framing her sharp, angular face. Her blue eyes sparkled with dangerous amusement as she casually adjusted the hem of her shirt, making sure the offensive words were fully visible. Her manicured nails, painted a deep, glossy red, trailed along the edge of the fabric in a slow, calculated gesture. David Carter, the African-American bailiff, stood stiffly behind the judge's bench. His broad shoulders were squared, and his hands were curled into tight fists at his sides. The tension in his posture was palpable. His dark eyes never left Jessica, watching her with quiet, cold intensity. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, was visibly sweating. His cheap gray suit was rumpled, and his tie sat crooked beneath his collar. His hands trembled as he shuffled through a stack of disorganized papers. Every so often, his gaze darted toward Jessica's shirt, as if hoping it might suddenly disappear. Rebecca sat still, her eyes focused on Jessica. Her lips were pressed into a thin, hard line. From her high position on the bench, she could see the impact Jessica's presence was having on the room. An older black woman in the gallery sat rigidly with her hands clasped together, her knuckles white from the pressure. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she stared at Jessica's shirt in silent horror. Beside the woman sat a young man, possibly her son, his body rigid with tension. His eyes were dark, his jaw clenched tight. He leaned slightly toward his mother, his arm protectively across the back of her chair. Jessica's gaze drifted toward them, slowly, deliberately. Rebecca saw the faint glint of amusement in Jessica's eyes as her gaze settled on the older woman. Jessica's smile widened, just slightly. "Ms. Cole," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a whip. Jessica's gaze slid toward Rebecca. "Yes, Your Honor? You are here for a traffic violation. Would you care to explain why you've chosen to turn this into a spectacle?" Jessica's smile sharpened. "Just expressing myself." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Expressing yourself, or trying to provoke a reaction?" Jessica tilted her head. "Aren't those the same thing?" Rebecca's nostrils flared. Across the room, David shifted his weight slightly. His fists were still clenched at his sides. Jessica leaned back, her arms stretched across the back of the chair. The hem of her tank top lifted slightly, making sure the offensive words remained clearly visible. Rebecca could feel the heat rising in the room. Quiet, simmering anger building beneath the surface, not just from the black attendees, but from everyone who had the misfortune of being trapped in the same space as Jessica Cole. Jessica's lawyer cleared his throat nervously. His hands were visibly shaking as he stood. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to plead not guilty to the charges of reckless driving." Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "Not guilty?" Richard nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. My client asserts that the traffic stop was improper and that the charges should be dismissed." Rebecca's eyes flicked toward Jessica. "Improper how?" Jessica's smile widened. "Racial profiling, of course." A ripple of disbelief swept through the gallery. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Jessica shrugged. "Well, I'm a blonde white woman driving a nice car through a bad neighborhood. Of course they pulled me over." David's jaw flexed dangerously. Rebecca could feel the heat radiating from him. Jessica's eyes slid toward David. Her smile curled into something razor-sharp. "What's the matter, officer?" Jessica's voice was dripping with venomous sweetness. "Feeling uncomfortable?" Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "Careful, Ms. Cole." Jessica's smile widened. "Why? Did I hit a nerve?" David's hands tightened at his sides. His breathing was slow and measured, but Rebecca could see the storm gathering behind his eyes. His professionalism was holding, barely. "Ms. Cole," Rebecca said slowly, her voice like a knife, "I suggest you remember where you are." Jessica leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "I think we both know where I am, Your Honor." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Do you?" Jessica's gaze flicked toward David again. "He knows." David's hand twitched at his side. His dark eyes burned into Jessica's smirking face. "Ms. Cole," Rebecca said coldly, "you are testing my patience." Jessica's smile turned predatory. "Good." Rebecca's gavel came down hard, a sharp, cutting crack that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Jessica didn't even flinch. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Cole," Rebecca said. Jessica's smile sharpened. "And you think you're winning?" Rebecca's eyes darkened. Jessica's gaze drifted lazily toward the older woman in the gallery. The woman's hands were trembling as she reached for a tissue. Jessica's eyes flashed with amusement. "You see?" Jessica said casually. "People get so emotional about these things. But it's just a shirt." David's jaw flexed. His hands were trembling now. "Just a shirt?" Rebecca repeated, her voice cold as ice. Jessica's smile widened. "Exactly." Rebecca could feel the heat of the room pressing down on her. The simmering fury was dangerously close to boiling over. The older woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes. Her son's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Jessica's eyes glinted as she looked toward them. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "You're walking a very fine line." Jessica's smile sharpened. "And?" David stepped toward Rebecca. His voice was low and tight. "Do you want me to remove her?" Rebecca's gaze stayed locked on Jessica's. Jessica's smile curled at the edges. Rebecca inhaled slowly. Every part of her screamed to order Jessica out, to punish her for the insult and the chaos she was creating. But Rebecca knew better. Jessica wanted to be dragged out. She wanted to make this a spectacle. "No," Rebecca said coolly. "Let her stay." Jessica's smile twitched, just slightly. Rebecca's lips curled into a thin, dangerous smile. "I want to see how this plays out." Jessica's smile faltered for half a second, but Rebecca saw it. For the first time, Jessica's confidence slipped. Just a crack. Just enough for Rebecca to know that Jessica Cole was no longer fully in control. Rebecca leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression cold and calculating. Jessica's eyes flashed with something sharp. Uncertainty. For the first time since she walked into the courtroom, Jessica wasn't sure she was winning. Rebecca's grip on her gavel tightened as the tension in the courtroom edged toward a breaking point. Jessica Cole sat at the defendant's table with a lazy, poisonous smirk. The offensive words on her shirt, "F black people," were like a knife in the gut of the room, twisting deeper with every second that passed. "Miss Cole," Rebecca said, her tone sharp as glass. "You are here for a traffic violation, but it seems you've chosen to make a statement." Jessica's smile widened. "Just exercising my First Amendment rights." Rebecca's eyes darkened. "You believe this is funny?" Jessica shrugged. "You tell me." The gallery was deathly quiet. The sound of the air conditioning hummed faintly in the background, but it might as well have been a drumbeat beneath the tension hanging in the air. Rebecca's gaze dropped to the shirt again, the offensive words stretching across Jessica's chest like a weapon, a deliberate attack on everyone in the room. David Carter stood stiffly behind the bench. His dark eyes burned into the back of Jessica's head. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his broad chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. He was holding on by a thread. "Do you think the words on that shirt represent free speech?" Rebecca's voice was dangerously calm. Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms. "Of course. It's America, right? Land of the free?" Rebecca's nostrils flared. Her sharp hazel eyes narrowed dangerously. Jessica's smile sharpened. "It's funny, isn't it? When certain people don't like what you have to say?" David's hand twitched at his side. His jaw tightened. Rebecca's knuckles whitened around the handle of her gavel. "Careful, Miss Cole." Jessica's eyes flashed. "Or what?" Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Or you will find out just how limited your freedom is in my courtroom. Jessica's smirk twisted into something darker. You sound threatened. Rebecca's gaze hardened. You sound desperate. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. Your Honor, Richard began nervously, my client... Sit down, Mr. Holloway. Richard froze, his face drained of color. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, his gaze darting toward Jessica, who didn't even acknowledge him. Jessica's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. Touchy. Rebecca's jaw tightened. You have walked into my courtroom with a blatant symbol of hatred and division, and you expect to be treated with respect? Jessica's smile curled at the edges. Respect is earned. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. And you think you've earned it? Jessica leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. I think I've earned the right to say whatever I want. Rebecca's eyes darkened. You think the right to speak excuses the consequences of your words? Jessica's eyes flashed. Maybe you're just angry because you know I'm right. Rebecca's nostrils flared. David's hand twitched again at his side. His eyes burned with quiet rage as he stared at Jessica. Jessica's smile widened. What's wrong, officer? Her tone was dripping with venom. Feeling uncomfortable? David's jaw flexed. Rebecca could almost feel the heat radiating off of him. His professionalism was holding, barely. Rebecca's voice cut through the air like a whip. That's enough! Jessica's gaze slid toward Rebecca, her smile never wavering. Or what? Jessica's voice was low and mocking. Rebecca leaned forward. Do not test me, Ms. Cole. Jessica's smile twisted. Why? Are you afraid of what might happen? Rebecca's eyes burned coldly. I don't deal in fear. Jessica leaned back in her chair. Then prove it. Rebecca's gaze darkened dangerously. Her hand tightened around the gavel, but she didn't raise it. Not yet. Jessica's gaze flicked toward the gallery. The older black woman in the front row had her head bowed, tears sliding down her cheeks. The young man beside her sat rigidly, his fists curled into tight balls at his sides. His eyes, dark and burning, were fixed on Jessica with barely contained rage. Jessica's gaze sharpened as it landed on the young man. Her lips curled upward. Rebecca saw it, the calculation in Jessica's eyes, the deliberate targeting. Don't, Rebecca said coldly. Jessica's gaze sharpened. Don't what? Don't. Rebecca's tone was lethal. Jessica smiled thinly. David's fists curled at his sides, his eyes blazed. Jessica's eyes flicked toward David. Her smile widened. What's wrong, officer? She said mockingly. Feeling attacked? David's jaw tightened. His breath hitched. Rebecca could feel the pressure in the room sharpening, the tension reaching a dangerous breaking point. Ms. Cole, Rebecca said, her voice dangerously calm. You are walking a very fine line. Jessica's smile widened. And? Rebecca's gaze sharpened. And you would do well to remember where that line is. Jessica's gaze glittered with malice. Or what? David's hands were shaking now. His chest was rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. Rebecca's gaze never left Jessica's face. Jessica tilted her head. What are you going to do, Your Honor? Rebecca leaned forward. Don't make me answer that question. Jessica's eyes flashed with amusement. Why not? Rebecca's gaze darkened. Because you won't like the answer. Jessica's smile widened. Rebecca saw it, the slight tremor beneath the surface. Jessica was still in control, but not entirely. There was a crack beginning to form beneath her carefully constructed arrogance. Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms. Whatever you say, Your Honor. Rebecca's gaze remained cold and steady. That's right. Jessica's smile twisted into a sneer. You think you've got the upper hand? Rebecca's eyes narrowed. We'll see. Jessica's eyes flashed. David took a step forward, his posture rigid. His eyes were dark and burning with quiet fury. Rebecca's gaze flicked toward him. Hold your position. David didn't move, but Rebecca saw the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. Jessica's gaze sharpened. What's the matter, officer? She purred. Feeling helpless? Rebecca's hand tightened around the handle of her gavel. Her gaze burned into Jessica's face. Jessica's eyes glinted with amusement. That's what I thought. Rebecca's gaze darkened. Careful. Jessica's smile sharpened. Or what? Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her expression cold and calculating. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Rebecca's lips curled into a thin, dangerous smile. Jessica's smile wavered. Just a little. Rebecca saw it. The first crack. Jessica Cole thought she was in control. She wasn't. Rebecca was holding the leash, and it was getting shorter. Rebecca's gavel slammed down hard, the sharp crack reverberating through the tense courtroom like a gunshot. You are held in contempt of court, Rebecca said coldly. Jessica's smirk twisted. Excuse me? You heard me, Rebecca said coolly. 5 days in county jail for contempt. Jessica's mouth dropped open. The color drained from her face. Her cocky, amused expression melted into something colder, more dangerous. Her blue eyes narrowed as the weight of Rebecca's words settled over her. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, jumped to his feet, his hands trembling. Your Honor, that's completely out of line. Rebecca's gaze turned on him like a whip. Sit down, Mr. Holloway. Richard froze. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly before he sank back into his seat, his hands clutching his papers like they might somehow protect him from the storm unfolding in front of him. Jessica's smirk twisted into a scowl. This is bull. One more word. Rebecca cut her off sharply, and I'll make it 10 days. Jessica's eyes flashed with fury. You can't do that. Rebecca's smile was thin and dangerous. Watch me. Jessica's hands curled into fists on the table. Her breathing quickened. The arrogance that had carried her so effortlessly into the courtroom was starting to slip. The room seemed to press in around her, the weight of Rebecca's authority settling like a cold hand on her throat. David Carter, standing just behind Rebecca's bench, took a single step forward. His broad frame cast a shadow across Jessica's face as he loomed over her. His dark eyes were steady and cold. Jessica's eyes flicked toward David, and for the first time, Rebecca saw a flash of uncertainty beneath her defiance. Her gaze darted toward the gallery, where the older black woman still sat with tears glistening on her cheeks. The young man beside her sat rigidly, his dark eyes burning into Jessica with quiet, simmering rage. Jessica's gaze hardened. You don't scare me. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Then you're more of a fool than I thought. Jessica's smile returned, brittle, forced. Fine. She straightened, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. This is just going to make me famous, you know. The media will eat this up. Rebecca's smile turned razor sharp. Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll see you for exactly what you are. Jessica's expression tightened. David's gaze remained steady. His shoulders were squared, his stance unyielding. He was waiting for Rebecca's command. Jessica's eyes narrowed. You're going to regret this. Rebecca's gaze was ice cold. No, Ms. Cole. The only one with regrets here is going to be you. Jessica's mouth twisted, her hands pressed against the table. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "This court is adjourned." Her gavel slammed down one last time. Jessica's smile vanished completely. Her jaw tightened. For the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of something behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Jessica had walked into this courtroom thinking she could control the outcome. That illusion was gone now. Rebecca stood, her eyes never leaving Jessica's face. Jessica's gaze sharpened. "You think this is over?" Rebecca's smile was thin. "No, but it's about to be." Jessica's eyes narrowed. Her hands flexed on the table. David stepped forward, his eyes cold and steady. Jessica's gaze flicked toward him, and for the first time, Rebecca saw the crack beneath her carefully maintained facade. Jessica wasn't in control anymore. Rebecca turned toward the court officers standing near the back of the room. Her voice was cool and steady. "Proceed." Jessica's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face darkened as David stepped toward her, her shoulders tensed. The tension in the room coiled tighter, like a spring about to snap. Rebecca watched as the shift happened. Jessica realized, too late, that the game was over. Rebecca's gaze remained steady as Jessica's smile disappeared completely. Jessica sat back, her jaw tight. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Rebecca's voice was calm. "Next case." It was supposed to be an ordinary day in the courtroom. Judge Rebecca Hayes had presided over hundreds of cases over her long career. After nearly 2 decades on the bench, there wasn't much that could surprise her anymore. Or so she thought. That morning, she had arrived at the courthouse prepared for a routine set of cases. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and maybe a small civil case or two. The usual. Predictable. The room was already buzzing with quiet chatter as the next case was called. Rebecca sat tall in her seat, the high wooden bench giving her a commanding view of the courtroom. Her dark brown hair, just starting to show streaks of silver, was pulled back into a low bun. Her black robe sat comfortably on her shoulders, the weight of it familiar after so many years. The gavel rested beneath her fingertips, and her sharp hazel eyes swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces, the bailiff, the court stenographer, the regular attorneys. And then the doors opened. She entered the courtroom with the kind of confidence that immediately drew attention. Jessica Cole, mid-30s, blonde, and undeniably beautiful, strutted toward the defendant's table as if the courtroom was a runway. Her designer jeans clung perfectly to her legs, her white tank top loose and effortless. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, a deliberate sound that seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the hushed room. But it wasn't her beauty or her expensive outfit that made the room freeze. It was the words printed boldly across the front of her shirt in large black letters. F. Black People. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp and immediate. A few people in the gallery whispered to each other in disbelief. Someone let out a soft, horrified laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when the mind can't quite process what it's seeing. Rebecca's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her fingers curled around the handle of her gavel as her pulse quickened. She could feel the tension in the air sharpening, becoming something tangible. The African-American bailiff, David Carter, stood frozen near the judge's bench. His jaw was tight, and Rebecca could see the muscles working beneath his dark skin as he struggled to keep his composure. Jessica Cole sauntered toward the defendant's table and slid into the chair like she had all the time in the world. A slow, lazy smirk curved her lips as she crossed her legs and leaned back in her seat. The white tank top sagged slightly at the neckline, making sure the offensive words on her shirt were clearly visible to everyone. Rebecca's gaze shifted toward Jessica's lawyer, a pale, nervous-looking man in a cheap suit. His thinning hair clung to his forehead in sweaty strands. He sat stiffly next to his client, flipping through a disorganized stack of papers with trembling hands. He clearly didn't know what to do, or how to handle the disaster that had just walked into the room. Rebecca's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Silence in the courtroom." The whispers died immediately, but the tension remained. The words on Jessica's shirt hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and suffocating. Rebecca let her gaze settle on Jessica, studying her carefully. "Miss Cole," Rebecca said, her voice sharp and controlled, "would you care to explain your attire?" Jessica's smirk widened. "What's there to explain?" Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You are aware that you're in a court of law?" Jessica shrugged. "Last time I checked, it's still America. Free speech and all that." Rebecca's jaw tightened. Her hazel eyes sharpened. "That is not free speech. That is hate speech." Jessica leaned back further in her seat, arms stretched lazily across the back of the chair. "Tomato. Tomato." A muscle in Rebecca's jaw twitched. Her fingers tightened around the gavel, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Years of experience had taught her not to give people like Jessica the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. David shifted slightly at his post, standing just to Rebecca's right. His eyes never left Jessica. His hands were still tightly clenched at his sides. Rebecca could almost feel the heat radiating off him, barely contained fury, held back only by sheer discipline. An older black woman sitting in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth. Her eyes glistened with tears. A young man beside her, possibly her son, put a hand on her shoulder and gave her a tense nod. Across the room, a group of attorneys whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. Jessica's smirk widened as she casually adjusted the hem of her shirt, making sure the offensive words were fully visible. Her gaze slid toward David, and Rebecca didn't miss the flash of malice in her eyes. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Jessica knew exactly what she was doing. "Ms. Cole," Rebecca said, her voice cold as steel, "you are here for a traffic violation, but it seems you've chosen to make a statement." Jessica sat frozen for a moment, her blue eyes burning with disbelief and fury. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then her gaze darkened, her jaw tightening as the full weight of Rebecca's ruling settled over her. Two officers approached Jessica's chair, their polished shoes thudding softly against the marble floor. "You have no right," Jessica hissed, jerking her arms away as they reached for her wrists. David Carter, the African-American bailiff, stepped forward calmly. His broad shoulders were squared, his dark eyes cold and steady. His expression was carved from stone. "Ma'am," David said, his voice low and controlled. "Stand up." Jessica's face twisted. "You're seriously arresting me for a shirt?" David's gaze was steady. "No," he said evenly, "for contempt of court." Jessica's hands slammed down on the table. Her nails dug into the polished wood. "This is insane." David's gaze didn't waver. "Stand up." Jessica's eyes flashed dangerously. "You can't do this to me." David didn't respond. His hand slid toward his cuffs. "This is why people hate your kind," Jessica spat. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The young black man sitting in the gallery visibly stiffened, his jaw tightening as he gripped the back of his mother's chair. His mother closed her eyes, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. David's jaw flexed, but his grip remained steady. His dark eyes sharpened dangerously, but his voice remained calm. "Ma'am, stand up." Jessica's nostrils flared. "I'll sue you." David's hand closed around her arm as she tried to pull away. Jessica yanked violently, but David's grip didn't slip. "Let me go." Jessica's voice rose to a shriek. "Don't resist," David said, his tone even but hard. Jessica twisted her body, but David tightened his hold, locking her in place. "You have no idea who I am!" Jessica screamed. David leaned closer, his voice low and cutting. "I know exactly who you are." Jessica's body jerked violently as David pulled her to her feet. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound was harsh and jarring in the tense silence of the courtroom. "Get your hands off me!" Jessica screamed. David's hand slid toward his belt. There was a sharp metallic click as he pulled the cuffs free. Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. "Turn around," David ordered. Jessica thrashed violently in his grip. "No, you can't." "Turn around," David repeated, his tone sharp. Jessica's mouth twisted into a snarl. "Touch me and you'll regret it!" David's jaw tightened. His patience was razor thin. His hand moved to her wrist, and in one smooth, controlled motion, he spun her around. Jessica's heels scraped against the floor as she stumbled. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "You can't do this!" Jessica screamed. Her voice was raw with disbelief and rage. David's grip was steady as he tightened the cuffs. "You have the right to remain silent," he said coldly. Jessica's body thrashed violently. "Don't touch me!" David's hand pressed firmly against her back as he steered her toward the exit. Jessica's legs buckled beneath her, but David didn't let her fall. "You're going to pay for this," Jessica shouted over her shoulder. "All of you." David's grip didn't waver. His expression was calm and impassive as he guided Jessica toward the back of the courtroom. The older black woman in the front row was still clutching her son's hand. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her gaze was steady as she watched Jessica being led away in cuffs. Her son's eyes burned with quiet fury. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, sat frozen at the defense table. His face was ghostly pale. His mouth was slightly open, his papers sitting forgotten in front of him. Jessica twisted toward Rebecca, her eyes blazing. "You think you're so righteous?" she spat. Rebecca's gaze was cold and unflinching. "No, Ms. Cole. Just consistent." Jessica's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're going to regret this." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "You keep saying that, and yet, here we are." Jessica's chest rose and fell rapidly. David adjusted his grip as Jessica bucked violently in his grasp. "This is a violation of my rights!" Jessica screamed. David's eyes sharpened. His tone remained calm. "Keep talking." Jessica's eyes widened. "What did you just say?" David's gaze sharpened. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it." Jessica's mouth curled into a sneer. "I'm going to make you pay for this." David's hand flexed slightly on her arm. His jaw tightened. "Good luck with that." Jessica thrashed again, her hair whipping across her face. The two officers flanking David closed in as they approached the side door of the courtroom. "You're making a mistake," Jessica shouted. David's expression was cold as steel. "No," he said. "The mistake was yours." Jessica's eyes burned with rage as David and the officers led her toward the exit. Her heels scraped against the floor as she twisted violently in their grip. The courtroom was utterly silent except for the sound of Jessica's angry breathing and the faint jingle of the cuffs around her wrists. David pushed open the heavy wooden doors, guiding Jessica through them. Jessica twisted violently one last time, and David's hand steadied her. Jessica's voice echoed back through the closing doors. "This isn't over." David's dark eyes remained steady as the doors shut with a heavy thud. For a moment, the room stood still. Rebecca's gaze lingered on the door. Slowly, her eyes shifted toward David, who had returned to his post beside the bench. His jaw was still tight, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. Rebecca's eyes softened slightly. "Are you all right?" David's gaze met hers. His expression remained steady. but Rebecca could see the quiet storm beneath the surface. "I'm fine," he said simply. Rebecca's gaze lingered for a beat longer before she straightened. Jessica's lawyer was still sitting at the table, his face pale and stunned. Slowly, his eyes lifted toward Rebecca. "Your Honor." Richard's voice was thin. Rebecca's gaze cut toward him. "Do you have anything else to say, Mr. Holloway?" Richard hesitated. "No, Your Honor." "Good." Rebecca stood. The tension in the room remained thick, but Rebecca's expression was calm. She glanced once more toward the gallery. The older woman and her son were still seated. The young man gave Rebecca a small nod of quiet gratitude. Rebecca inclined her head slightly in return. She turned toward the court clerk. "We'll recess for 5 minutes." Rebecca stepped down from the bench, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she exited through the side door. Behind her, the courtroom remained deathly quiet. As Jessica was dragged toward the exit, Rebecca's sharp hazel eyes followed her. Jessica's blonde hair whipped across her face as she twisted violently in David's grip, her mouth still twisted in a snarl of disbelief. The cold metal of the handcuffs glinted beneath the harsh courtroom lights. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, stumbled to his feet, his face flushed with panic. His papers spilled onto the table, forgotten as he tried to steady himself. "This is a violation of her rights," Richard shouted. His thin voice cracked beneath the weight of the room's tension. "You can't arrest someone for wearing a shirt." Rebecca's gaze cut toward him like a knife. "Really?" Her tone was ice cold. "Because I think you'll find that hate speech is not protected under the First Amendment in this courtroom." Richard's mouth opened and closed uselessly. He glanced toward the gallery as if expecting support, but the room remained silent. No one was coming to Jessica's defense. Jessica twisted toward Rebecca, her blue eyes blazing. "You can't do this to me." Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "You already did this to yourself." Jessica's mouth snapped shut. David and the officers reached the side door. Jessica's heels scraped against the floor as she struggled in their grip. "This isn't over," Jessica screamed over her shoulder. David didn't even flinch. His grip remained steady as the officers pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Jessica's final scream echoed through the room as the doors slammed shut behind her with a heavy boom. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Several people exchanged wide-eyed glances. The older black woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. Her son sat tense and rigid beside her, his jaw still tight. But Rebecca saw the brief flicker of relief in his eyes. Rebecca's gaze remained steady as the noise in the room slowly died down. The weight of her ruling settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. David stepped toward the bench, his expression calm but guarded. His dark eyes met Rebecca's. "Thank you," he said quietly. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "No need to thank me." David's gaze darkened. "You didn't have to do that." Rebecca's lips thinned. "Yes, I did." David's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he gave a single nod. Slowly he turned and made his way toward the side exit. Jessica's lawyer still stood frozen at the defense table. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. Rebecca's gaze slid toward him. "Mr. Holloway," she said coldly. Richard straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you have anything else to add?" Richard hesitated. His lips parted as though he might try to salvage something from the wreckage of the case. But then his shoulders sagged. His gaze dropped toward the scattered papers on the table. "No, Your Honor," he said weakly. Rebecca's gaze hardened. "Good." She glanced toward the clerk. "Next case." Rebecca stood slowly, her hands resting on the polished wood of the bench. She turned toward the exit at the back of the courtroom. As she walked toward the door, the quiet murmur of the gallery followed her. The older woman and her son were still seated in the front row. The woman gave Rebecca a small nod of gratitude. The young man's gaze remained steady, dark and guarded, but his fists had finally unclenched. Rebecca inclined her head toward them. As she stepped through the side door, the noise from the courtroom faded behind her. Rebecca's heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked down the empty hallway. Her pace remained steady. Her breathing was even. But the echo of Jessica's last words lingered in her mind. "This isn't over." Rebecca's gaze darkened. "We'll see." The courtroom slowly settled as people whispered among themselves. Quiet murmurs rippled through the room, a low hum of disbelief and satisfaction mixing beneath the polished wood and marble. Jessica was gone, but the weight of her presence and her downfall still lingered in the air. Jessica's lawyer, Richard Holloway, stood at the defense table, gathering his scattered papers with shaking hands. His face was pale, and his shoulders sagged as he shoved the documents into his briefcase without bothering to organize them. He avoided Rebecca's gaze entirely as he turned and hurried toward the exit, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Rebecca stood slowly, smoothing her black robe as she stepped down from the bench. Her heels clicked softly as she approached David, who stood near the side door. His posture was still tense, his broad shoulders squared beneath the crisp lines of his uniform. His dark eyes were steady, but Rebecca could see the tightness in his jaw. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked quietly. David's gaze remained focused on the door for a moment longer before he turned toward her. He gave a small nod, but Rebecca didn't miss the flicker of tension beneath his controlled exterior. "Yeah," David said finally. "Just tired of seeing people like her get away with this." Rebecca's gaze softened. "Not today." David's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "No, not today." Rebecca exhaled slowly, her eyes drifting toward the empty defendant's table where Jessica had sat only minutes before. "Prepare the paperwork for her jail time," Rebecca said evenly. "And make sure this story gets to the press." David's smile sharpened slightly. "I think that part will take care of itself." Rebecca's gaze darkened slightly. "It needs to be done right." David's eyes flashed with quiet understanding. "It will be." Rebecca studied him for a moment longer before she gave a small nod. David hesitated. His eyes softened slightly. "She pushed you hard today." Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "She pushed everyone." David's jaw flexed. "And you pushed back." Rebecca's lips curled faintly. "That's my job." David's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded and turned toward the door. Rebecca's gaze followed him as he left. The soft click of the door closing behind him echoed through the empty room. Rebecca stood alone in the silent courtroom. Outside the heavy wooden doors, the buzz of reporters and cameras was already beginning to gather. The fallout was inevitable. Jessica Cole had walked into that courtroom thinking she was untouchable, and she had walked out in handcuffs. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. Her hand brushed across the polished wood of the bench. A thin smile touched her lips. Justice, finally. Rebecca turned and walked toward the side door, her heels echoing softly as the weight of the moment settled into her bones. She didn't look back. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones jostled for position as the large wooden doors opened. The low murmur of the crowd rose sharply when Jessica Cole was led out between two officers, her wrists cuffed in front of her. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and the smug confidence that had once defined her was nowhere to be seen. Jessica's blue eyes flashed with thinly concealed rage as reporters shouted over one another. "Jessica, did you expect this outcome?" Jessica, do you have any comment on the judge's ruling? Jessica, are you going to appeal? Jessica's jaw clenched. Her gaze narrowed dangerously toward the nearest camera. This is a political hit job, she hissed. You'll hear from my lawyer. This isn't over. David Carter stood at the bottom of the steps, his broad shoulders squared beneath his crisp uniform. His dark eyes remained steady as Jessica was led toward a waiting squad car. Jessica's gaze flicked toward him. You think you've won? David's face remained impassive. No, he said quietly. Justice won. Jessica's lips curled into a sneer, but David saw the crack beneath the surface, the growing fear behind her eyes. The officer beside Jessica opened the back door of the squad car. Jessica hesitated for half a second, her eyes flashing toward the crowd, as if she were still calculating a way out. But there was no escape this time. Slowly, she lowered her head and slid into the car. The door slammed shut. The reporters surged forward, flashes of light bouncing off the windows of the squad car as it pulled away from the curb. Jessica's pale face disappeared behind the tinted glass. David remained at the bottom of the steps, his hands resting lightly at his sides. Officer Carter? A young reporter pushed forward, shoving a microphone toward him. Do you think Jessica Cole got what she deserved? David's gaze remained calm. I think the judge said everything that needed to be said. Behind him, the courthouse doors opened again. Rebecca Hayes stepped out, her black robe catching the light as the breeze lifted the edges. The crowd quieted slightly at the sight of her. Rebecca descended the steps slowly, her hazel eyes focused on the disappearing squad car. David's gaze shifted toward her. You handled that well, David said quietly. Rebecca's lips curled faintly. So did you. A microphone swung toward her. Judge Hayes, was the ruling personal? Rebecca's eyes narrowed. It was legal. Do you expect her to appeal? Rebecca's gaze sharpened. That's her right. Do you think the message you sent today will resonate? Rebecca's eyes flashed toward the reporter. It's not about the message, she said coolly. It's about the law. The reporter hesitated. But do you feel justice was served? Rebecca's gaze remained steady. I know it was. David's eyes softened slightly. He stepped closer as the reporters surged toward Rebecca with more questions. Shall I clear the way? David asked, his voice low. Rebecca smiled faintly. I can handle them. David's gaze lingered on her for a beat longer before he gave a small nod. I'll be inside. Rebecca's gaze followed him briefly as he moved toward the entrance of the courthouse. David's broad frame disappeared into the shadows of the building. The reporters' voices grew louder. Judge Hayes! Judge Hayes! Rebecca's gaze cut toward them, sharp and direct. No further questions. She turned and walked back toward the courthouse. Her heels clicked softly against the stone steps as she disappeared through the heavy doors. Behind her, the noise of the crowd grew fainter. The cameras kept flashing. Inside the courthouse, Rebecca stood at the bottom of the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the wooden railing. David stood nearby, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp as ever. Any regrets? He asked quietly. Rebecca's gaze darkened slightly. No. David's expression softened. Good. Rebecca inhaled slowly. She'll fight it. David's jaw flexed. Let her. Rebecca's lips twitched faintly. I'm counting on it. David's eyes darkened. If she comes back, we'll be ready. Rebecca's gaze lingered on David for a beat longer. A quiet understanding passed between them. Then Rebecca turned toward the hallway. The quiet weight of the courthouse settled around her. Justice had been served, and if Jessica Cole came back, Rebecca Hayes would be waiting.